Hi everyone, I'm Emily, and the research I did was whether or not prisons like the Eastern State Penitentiary should be used for tourism. Is it ethical for them to be open for tourism like some are today? My thesis states it is ethical for a former penitentiary like the Eastern State one to be repurposed for tourism, since the building's architecture is symbolic of its philosophy and is used to explain the layout, and is used to explain the overcrowdedness in prisons today, and clearly depicts the history of the past. So my first point on that the prison should be used for tourism and still should remain open is because the building's architecture and design is symbolic of its philosophy, and that further promotes what the prison was about and how it affected the inmates. So in PB's citation that's called Terror Behind the Walls, they explain how the design and the layout of the prison affected the inmates mentally. The prison opened in time during a prison reform movement, so it was pushed open by the first prison reform group ever, and it tried to alleviate the stress of the other prison systems, because at the time prisons in the 18th and 19th century were used to scare inmates and to punish them, not to reform them and rehabilitate them, which is what Eastern State intended to do in the beginning, but they may not have done that very well. They pioneered a system of solitary confinement, which is separate rooms, which was initially meant to reform them and not intimidate them, but again, no one knew the mental effects of solitary confinement till later on. Actually, Charles Dickens at the time visited the prison system and the solitary confinement cells, and he thought that was even more humane than being buried alive. If you look at the prison from above, it looks like a wagon wheel. So the cell blocks go out, and there's one officer in the middle that can patrol and watch all other cell blocks. So it was designed for many prisoners under little watch. Being like that, it was a huge prison and all this stuff was put into it. It was the most expensive and largest prison in the world. Due to the digital tour I took on their website, that you have to set up with someone, the prison was designed like a cathedral. When you walk in, they have high ceilings like a church would. And every cell block, the only piece of reading that would be in there is a Bible. And it looked like the cell blocks look like a penance room, for when you're saying confession to the priest. This even further proves the point that this was meant for reform and rehabilitation rather than punishment, because if the only thing you can read is a Bible and it looks like a cathedral, they wanted to bring God into people's lives, which is a very big thing at the movement. At the time, religion. So that is the first point. The second point is that it should be open for tourism because it teaches people about the overcrowding and mass incarceration problem back then, and that still persists today in the prison systems. On the main website of the Eastern State Penitentiary, and at the digital tour and regular tours you take, there's a picture, or if you'll go see it in the tours, at the end of the tour, there's a big bar graph, life-size bar graph, and it explains the overcrowdedness and mass incarceration problems in the United States versus other countries, and it brings in other issues as well. It shows the growth of incarceration rates in the U.S. alone since 1900 compared to other countries, and of course, here's other countries, and the United States is right above because we have the largest growing incarceration rate in the world. On the north side of the bar, there's different things that they touch on. They touch about the racial breakdown since 1917, and even though in 1960 the Equal Rights Amendments were passed and acts, you can still see the increase of colored people being incarcerated, or people of a different race or ethnicity rather than white people. So they bring that into account on this little bar graph at the end. And on the other side, it shows every nation by capital punishment, and the United States uses capital punishment much more than any other country. The U.S. has imprisoned only 100. The U.S. for more than a century, the U.S. has imprisoned more than between 100 to 200 people for every 100,000 people at the time the prison opened. But this changed when Eastern State closed and new laws were being put into place with longer sentences. Now the U.S. imprisons more than 700 people for every 1,000 citizens, which is the highest incarceration state in the world. From the Pacific Standard website, I found that 2.2 million prisoners in American jails. There's 2.2 million prisoners in American jails, and the U.S. holds more than 20% of this rate. Eastern State, because it's such a big prison and penitentiary, they this big bar graph at the end, especially at their tour, targets an audience that isn't unknown, that's unknown about the mass incarceration problem in our country that happened back then, that still happens today. And they try to teach people about the failure of our criminal justice system that we have in this country and how we need to change the legal structure that these prisons are being run on. One other interesting fact about Eastern State was that it was meant to hold 300 prisoners at a time. That's how many the guard could watch. But more towards the end of the prison, they were just imprisoning so many people for vagrancy, for drunkenness, just like all different stuff just to get people off the streets, that they actually had to hold up 2,000 people at a time in the single cell box. So 8 people would be shoved in a single cell block at Eastern State Penitentiary because there were just so many people, and then everybody being shoved in one cell block moved away from the point that they wanted to do solitary confinement cells, which didn't work, but that's what the prison intended to do. So the overcrowding problem persisted, even though they tried. There was a few decades where it worked, but then at the end of the prison times, the overcrowding started happening again. The last point why the prison should be open for tourism is because it explains the history of the past. I love history, and I'm a history minor. I think it is so important to know, just like the history about everything, so you don't repeat it. You learn from it, you grow from it. History should never be erased, which is a great example of the Eastern State, because when they were deciding whether or not to reuse it, knock it down, they thought it was so important that they should be able to keep it for history. I actually found an account of this girl, Julia Moore, who was a female who died in Eastern State Penitentiary in 1843. She went into the jail for robbery in the summer in 1839. There'd be a minister that always went into her cell, again, reinforcing the idea of reforming and rehabilitating yourself with Jesus that they had. And the minister said himself that she had been a lost, undone creature. So her being in a solitary confinement cell, thinking all this stuff, this really took a toll on her mental health. She would constantly read the Bible, mourning her sins, because all she wanted to do was get out. In the beginning, she was lonely, but it became happy, like a little happy home to her, because she would always think about life and death to her in these accounts brought happiness to her, which is not something normal. She had repeated attacks of illnesses and dreams, and she was always at the doctors, and she eventually died from mental health issues and her anxiety being too well that she ended up killing herself in the prison because her mental health took such a toll on herself. Another account is to the Smithsonian Magazine, was that about the history of the past. William Penn in Pennsylvania, all before when we started becoming a country, tried to avoid the harsh criminal code system of the country when the colonies were first created. And Penn relied on imprisonment with hard labors and fees, while death remained the only penalty for murder. But after he died in 1718, PA, prisoners would be a detention center from now on. And then the Eastern State opened and did the opposite of what he wanted. and just fell against like their more like what PA was created on for their prison systems. And yeah, that was it. So that is my thing on the Eastern State Penitentiary.